The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood by his study window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The weight of the day ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders, and for a moment, the future King of England allowed himself to feel the full burden of what was to come. Today would mark one of the most challenging public appearances of his royal career, and he knew that every eye would be watching, every camera would be recording, and every word would be analyzed. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, entered the room quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She had been married to William long enough to recognize the tension in his posture, the way his jaw tightened when he was struggling with difficult emotions. Without saying a word, she moved to stand beside him at the window, her presence offering the silent support that had become their unspoken language over the years. The event they were preparing for was no ordinary royal engagement. It was a memorial service for children who had lost their lives in a tragic accident that had shaken the entire nation. The families affected had specifically requested that William and Catherine attend, believing that the presence of the royal couple might bring some measure of comfort during their darkest hour. Both William and Catherine had children of their own, and the thought of these grieving families had kept them awake for nights leading up to this day. William turned away from the window and looked at his wife. Catherine's usually bright eyes were shadowed with the same concern that weighed on his heart. They had discussed this appearance countless times, knowing that it would require them to be pillars of strength, while their own hearts were breaking for these families. The challenge was not just in offering comfort to others, but in maintaining their composure when every parental instinct screamed with empathy and sorrow. The palace staff had been preparing for days, coordinating with security teams and event organizers to ensure that everything would proceed smoothly. But William and Catherine both knew that no amount of planning could prepare them for the raw emotion they would encounter. They had received briefings about each family, learning the names and ages of the children who had been lost, understanding the circumstances that had led to this tragedy. Each detail had carved itself deeper into their hearts. Catherine moved to her dressing table and began the familiar ritual of preparing for a public appearance. But today, every choice felt weighted with significance. What color would be appropriate? How should she style her hair? Every decision seemed to carry the responsibility of representing not just the royal family, but the entire nation's grief. She chose a simple black dress, elegant but not ostentatious, and minimal jewelry that would not distract from the solemnity of the occasion. William, meanwhile, reviewed his notes one final time. He had written and rewritten his remarks, struggling to find words that could somehow convey the depth of the nation's sympathy without sounding hollow or rehearsed. How do you speak to parents who have lost everything? How do you offer hope to families whose worlds have been shattered? These were questions that haunted him as he prepared to face the most difficult audience of his life. The couple's children had been told about the event in age-appropriate terms. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis understood that their parents were going to help some families who were very sad because they had lost people they loved. The innocence in their children's questions had only made William and Catherine more acutely aware of how precious and fragile life could be. As they made their final preparations, both William and Catherine found themselves thinking about their own parents. William remembered how his mother, Princess Diana, had navigated similar situations with grace and genuine emotion. He could almost hear her voice encouraging him to speak from the heart, to let his humanity show through the formality of royal protocol. Catherine thought of her own parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, and how they had taught her that true strength came not from hiding emotions, but from channeling them into meaningful action. The car arrived precisely on schedule, its polished, black exterior reflecting the cloudy sky above. As they prepared to leave, William took Catherine's hand in his. The simple gesture spoke volumes about their partnership, their shared commitment to supporting each other through the most challenging aspects of their royal duties. They had learned over the years that their strength lay not in individual perfection, but in their ability to lean on each other when the weight of responsibility became overwhelming. The drive to the venue was conducted in relative silence, both William and Catherine lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. They passed through streets lined with people who had gathered to pay their respects, many holding flowers or small tributes. The sight of ordinary citizens taking time from their busy lives to show support for grieving families served as a reminder of the fundamental decency that existed in their nation, even in the darkest times. As their car approached the venue, they could see the gathered media, the security barriers, and the small groups of families who had already arrived. Some of the family members were immediately recognizable from the photographs they had seen during their briefings, and the reality of meeting these grieving parents suddenly became immediate and overwhelming. This was no longer an abstract royal duty, but a very real encounter with human suffering that would test every aspect of their emotional strength. William squeezed Catherine's hand one final time as their car came to a stop. In moments, they would step out into the public eye and begin one of the most emotionally challenging days of their royal career. They would need to be strong for others while managing their own overwhelming feelings of sympathy and sorrow. The next few hours would require them to find a balance between royal protocol and genuine human compassion, all while the world watched their every expression and gesture. The door of their car was opened by a palace aide, and the sounds of the outside world rushed in. It was time to step forward and fulfill their duty, knowing that their presence might provide some small comfort to families whose pain seemed impossible to bear. As they prepared to emerge, both William and Catherine took deep breaths, steeling themselves for the emotional marathon that lay ahead. The moment William and Catherine stepped out of their car, they were immediately struck by the atmosphere of profound grief that hung over the gathering. Despite the presence of media and security personnel, there was a hushed reverence in the air that spoke to the gravity of the occasion. The venue, a community center that had been transformed into a memorial space, was surrounded by flowers, photographs, and small mementos left by members of the public who wanted to show their support for the affected families. Catherine's first instinct was to reach for William's arm, a subtle gesture that provided mutual comfort as they began to navigate through the crowd of officials and family members. The first person to approach them was the local mayor, whose own eyes were red-rimmed from emotion. As he began to brief them on the order of events, both William and Catherine found themselves scanning the faces around them, trying to identify the family members they would soon be meeting. The weight of the moment became even more real when they saw the memorial displays that had been created for each child. Photographs showing bright smiles and happy moments were arranged alongside favorite toys, school awards, and handwritten letters from classmates. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat as she looked at these tangible reminders of young lives cut short. Each display told a story of potential unrealized, dreams that would never be fulfilled, and families whose lives had been forever changed. William found himself particularly drawn to a display featuring a young boy who had been the same age as Prince George. The similarities were striking, from the gap-toothed grin in the photograph to the soccer trophies that spoke of weekend games and proud parents cheering from the sidelines. For a moment, the carefully maintained emotional barriers that protected him during difficult royal duties began to crack, and he had to turn away to regain his composure. The first family they were introduced to consisted of parents who had lost their 7-year-old daughter. The mother, still clutching a tissue in her trembling hands, looked up at Catherine with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and unbearable sadness. When Catherine knelt down to the woman's eye level and took her hands, the gesture was so genuine and spontaneous that several onlookers felt their own emotions begin to overwhelm them. The conversation that followed was unlike any typical royal engagement. There were no scripted pleasantries or formal protocols to follow. Instead, Catherine found herself listening as the mother shared memories of her daughter's laugh, her love of drawing, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. These were not the sanitized stories usually shared during royal visits, but raw, unfiltered glimpses into a life that had been taken too soon. William, meanwhile, was speaking with the child's father, who was struggling to maintain his composure as he described his daughter's last school performance. The man's voice broke as he explained how proud he had been, sitting in the audience and watching his little girl sing with such confidence and joy. The memory was precious to him, but it was also a source of almost unbearable pain because it represented the last time he would see his daughter perform. As they moved from family to family, both William and Catherine found themselves tested in ways they had never experienced during their royal duties. Each conversation brought new stories of loss, new displays of grief, and new challenges to their emotional stability. They met parents who had lost multiple children, grandparents who were trying to support their own adult children while dealing with their own grief, and siblings who were struggling to understand why their brothers and sisters were never coming home. One particularly heart-wrenching encounter involved a young mother who had lost her infant son. The woman was barely older than Catherine herself, and the raw anguish in her eyes was impossible to ignore. When she broke down while trying to explain how quiet her house had become without her baby's cries, Catherine found herself fighting back tears for the first time during the event. The mother's pain was so immediate and overwhelming that it cut through every defense mechanism and royal training. William noticed his wife's struggle and smoothly stepped in to continue the conversation, giving Catherine a moment to collect herself. This kind of wordless communication had become second nature to them during their years of marriage and royal service, but it had never been more crucial than it was today. They were taking turns being strong for each other, recognizing that they could not both break down simultaneously while still fulfilling their duty to these grieving families. The memorial service itself was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, but already both William and Catherine felt emotionally drained from their individual conversations with family members. They had been prepared for sadness, but nothing could have prepared them for the intensity of the grief they were witnessing. These were not abstract victims of a tragedy reported in newspapers, but real people whose pain was immediate and overwhelming. During a brief moment when they were able to step away from the families, Catherine turned to William with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She didn't need to say anything for him to understand that she was struggling with the emotional weight of what they were experiencing. William himself was fighting his own battle with composure, particularly after meeting several fathers whose grief reminded him of his own devastating loss when his mother died. The venue coordinator approached them to review the final details of the memorial service. William would be expected to deliver remarks to the gathered crowd, while Catherine would participate in a moment of remembrance that involved lighting candles for each child who had been lost. Both of these responsibilities suddenly seemed monumentally challenging given the emotional state they were both experiencing. As they prepared to enter the main hall where the service would take place, William and Catherine took a moment to center themselves. They knew that the most difficult part of the day was still ahead of them. They would need to maintain their composure in front of hundreds of people, while participating in a ceremony designed to honor children whose deaths had touched their hearts in unexpected ways. The doors to the main hall opened and they could see the sea of faces waiting for them inside. Family members, community leaders, and representatives from various organizations had gathered to pay their respects and to witness this moment of royal acknowledgement of their loss. William offered his arm to Catherine, and together they prepared to enter what would prove to be one of the most emotionally challenging events of their royal career. As William and Catherine entered the main hall, the hushed silence that greeted them was almost overwhelming. Hundreds of people had gathered, their faces reflecting the same mixture of grief and hope that had characterized every interaction throughout the day. The hall had been decorated with photographs and flowers, creating a beautiful but heartbreaking tribute to the children whose lives were being remembered. The seating arrangement placed the grieving families in the front rows, with William and Catherine positioned where they could easily see every face in the audience. This proximity to the families made it impossible to maintain any emotional distance, and both royals found themselves making eye contact with parents and siblings whose pain was written clearly across their features. Catherine took her seat and immediately noticed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, sitting in the front row with what appeared to be her grandparents. The child's eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a small stuffed animal that looked well-worn from constant holding. When their eyes met, the little girl offered a small, brave smile that nearly shattered Catherine's carefully maintained composure. The courage of this child, who was clearly trying to be strong despite her own grief, served as both an inspiration and a reminder of how deeply this tragedy had affected even the youngest members of these families. William, meanwhile, found himself studying the memorial program that had been placed on his seat. Each page contained photographs and brief descriptions of the children being remembered, along with messages from their families and friends. Reading these personal tributes while sitting just feet away from the people who had written them created an intimacy that was unlike anything he had experienced in his royal duties. These were not distant tragedies being observed from afar, but immediate human stories unfolding in real time. The service began with a local choir performing a hymn that had special significance to the community. The voices of the children in the choir were particularly poignant, serving as a reminder of the bright futures that had been lost. Several family members began crying during the performance, and the sound of their quiet sobs created an undercurrent of grief that permeated the entire hall. When it came time for William to deliver his remarks, he approached the podium with hands that trembled slightly despite his years of public speaking experience. Looking out at the sea of faces, he could see the expectation in their eyes. These families were looking to him not just as a representative of the royal family, but as someone who might be able to offer words that could provide even the smallest measure of comfort in their darkest hour. William began by acknowledging that no words could truly capture the magnitude of the loss these families were experiencing. His voice, usually strong and confident during public appearances, carried a noticeable tremor that revealed the genuine emotion behind his carefully chosen words. He spoke about the privilege of meeting each family individually and learning about the unique personalities and dreams of their children. As he continued speaking, William found himself departing from his prepared remarks to share more personal observations about the children he had learned about that day. He mentioned the little boy who had wanted to be a firefighter, the girl who had collected books about animals, and the toddler who had been learning to say his first words. These details brought the lost children to life for everyone present, but they also intensified the emotional atmosphere in the room. Catherine watched her husband's face as he spoke, recognizing the signs that indicated he was struggling to maintain his composure. She could see the slight tightening around his eyes and the way he paused between sentences to steady himself. Her own emotions were running high, but her primary concern in that moment was for William and the enormous emotional burden he was carrying as he tried to find words adequate for such profound loss. The most challenging moment came when William began to speak about parenthood and the universal fears that all parents carry about their children's safety. His voice broke slightly as he acknowledged that every parent in the room had experienced their worst nightmare, and that the entire nation shared in their grief. The raw honesty of his emotion was visible to everyone present, and several family members nodded in recognition of his genuine understanding of their pain. When William concluded his remarks, the applause was subdued and respectful, but the impact of his words was evident in the faces throughout the audience. He had managed to strike a balance between royal formality and genuine human emotion that resonated deeply with the grieving families. As he returned to his seat, Catherine reached for his hand, offering silent support as he worked to regain his emotional equilibrium. The next portion of the service involved the lighting of individual candles in memory of each child. Catherine was invited to participate in this ritual, and she approached the memorial table where photographs of all the children were displayed alongside white candles. As she lit each candle, she took a moment to look at the corresponding photograph, trying to honor each child's individual memory. The process of lighting 12 candles while looking at 12 young faces proved to be more emotionally challenging than Catherine had anticipated. Each photograph captured a moment of happiness or achievement, showing children who had been loved and cherished by their families. By the time she reached the final candle, her hands were shaking noticeably and tears were beginning to form in her eyes despite her best efforts to remain composed. The image that affected her most profoundly was of a 3-year-old girl with curls similar to Princess Charlotte's, wearing a bright pink dress and laughing at something outside the camera frame. The joy captured in that photograph stood in stark contrast to the grief that now surrounded the child's memory, and Catherine found herself thinking about her own daughter and how precious these ordinary moments of childhood happiness truly were. As Catherine returned to her seat after completing the candle lighting ceremony, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room following her movements. The families were watching for any sign that their pain was being truly understood and acknowledged, while the media representatives were documenting every expression and gesture for the public record. The weight of representing not just herself, But the entire royal family's compassion created an additional layer of pressure during an already emotionally overwhelming experience. The service continued with readings from family members and community leaders, each sharing memories and reflections about the children who had been lost. William and Catherine listened intently to every word, recognizing that their presence and attention were perhaps the most meaningful gifts they could offer to these grieving families during this impossibly difficult time. The most heart-wrenching moment of the entire service came when a father stood up to read a letter his 6-year-old son had written to Santa Claus just weeks before the tragedy. The letter, written in careful block letters with several misspelled words, asked for a new bike and for his baby sister to sleep through the night so Mommy wouldn't be so tired. The innocence captured in those simple requests, combined with the knowledge that this child would never receive those Christmas gifts, created a wave of emotion that swept through the entire hall. Catherine felt tears begin to stream down her face as she listened to the father's voice break while reading his son's words. She had tried so hard to maintain her composure throughout the day, but the combination of exhaustion and overwhelming sadness finally broke through her carefully constructed emotional barriers. She reached into her purse for a tissue, her hands trembling as she tried to discreetly wipe away the tears that she could no longer hold back. William noticed his wife's distress and felt his own emotional control begin to slip. Seeing Catherine cry made the reality of the situation even more immediate and painful. These were not just statistics or names in a briefing document, but real children whose lives had been cut short in the most tragic way possible. The father continued reading, his voice growing stronger as he shared his son's promise to be good and help take care of his little sister, words that now carried unbearable poignancy. As the father concluded the reading and returned to his seat, the silence in the hall was deafening. Even the media representatives seemed affected by what they had just witnessed, and several could be seen wiping away their own tears. The raw humanity of the moment had transcended all boundaries of protocol and professionalism, creating a shared experience of grief that united everyone present. The next family to participate in the service was a mother who chose to sing a lullaby that she used to perform for her twin daughters every night before bed. Her voice, though wavering with emotion, carried a beauty that spoke to the deep love she had for her children. Catherine found herself thinking about her own bedtime routines with George, Charlotte, and Louis, imagining how devastating it would be to never again have the opportunity to sing them to sleep. William was struggling with his own memories as he listened to the lullaby. He remembered his mother singing to him when he was young, and later he recalled singing the same songs to his own children. The universality of these parental rituals made the loss even more profound, because every parent in the room could relate to the simple joy of tucking a child into bed and the unimaginable pain of never being able to do so again. As the service continued, both William and Catherine found themselves making more personal connections with the families. During a brief intermission, they were approached by a grandmother who wanted to share photographs of her grandson. The woman's hands shook as she showed them pictures from the boy's recent birthday party, pointing out his gap-toothed grin and explaining how excited he had been to turn 5 years old. Catherine knelt down to get a better look at the photographs, and as she did, the grandmother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The older woman whispered that she was grateful for their presence, explaining that having the royal couple there made her feel like her grandson's life had mattered to more than just their immediate family. This simple expression of gratitude hit Catherine with unexpected force as she realized the enormous responsibility that came with their royal status during moments of national tragedy. William was engaged in a similar conversation with a group of siblings who had lost their younger brother. The oldest, a teenager who was clearly trying to be strong for his parents, explained how difficult it was to go back to school and pretend that everything was normal when their family had been forever changed. William found himself sharing his own experiences of losing his mother at a young age, explaining how grief could feel overwhelming, but that it was important to hold on to the happy memories while allowing yourself to feel sad when necessary. The conversation with these siblings reminded William of his own relationship with Harry, and how they had supported each other through their mother's death and the years that followed. He could see the same protective instincts in the older brother, who was clearly trying to shield his parents from additional pain while dealing with his own grief. The maturity and courage displayed by these young people in the face of unimaginable loss was both inspiring and heartbreaking. As the formal service concluded, William and Catherine were invited to participate in a final moment of remembrance. All the families gathered in a circle, holding hands as they observed a minute of silence for the children they had lost. Standing in this circle, surrounded by parents, grandparents, and siblings whose lives had been shattered, both royals felt the full weight of the tragedy in a way that no briefing or preparation could have conveyed. The minute of silence stretched on, punctuated only by the quiet sobs of family members and the distant sounds of traffic from the street outside. Catherine found herself thinking about each child whose photograph she had seen, trying to honor their individual memories while standing with the people who had loved them most. The responsibility of representing the nation's grief felt enormous, but it was overwhelmed by her personal emotional response to the stories she had heard throughout the day. When the minute concluded, several family members remained in the circle, reluctant to break the connection that had been formed through shared grief and remembrance. William and Catherine stayed with them, understanding instinctively that their role was to follow the family's lead, rather than impose any timeline or protocol on this deeply personal moment. One of the mothers reached out to embrace Catherine, whispering words of thanks for their presence and for the genuine emotion they had shown throughout the day. Catherine found herself returning the embrace with an intensity that surprised her, realizing that she needed the comfort as much as she was trying to provide it. The boundary between royal duty and personal emotion had completely dissolved, leaving only human beings supporting each other through an impossible situation. William received similar expressions of gratitude from several fathers, who appreciated that he had shared his own experiences with loss and had spoken about parenthood with such obvious sincerity. These men, who were dealing with grief beyond imagination, somehow found the strength to comfort him when they could see how deeply affected he was by their stories. As the formal memorial service concluded, William and Catherine prepared for the final portion of their visit, knowing that they would need to find the strength to continue offering support and comfort, even though their own emotional reserves were nearly exhausted. Following the memorial service, William and Catherine were invited to visit a special garden that had been created in memory of the children. The garden, which had been designed and planted by community volunteers in just a few short weeks, featured 12 small trees, each one representing one of the lost children. Beneath each tree, family members had placed personal mementos, favorite toys, and handwritten letters that would remain as permanent tributes to their loved ones. As they walked through the garden paths, Catherine was particularly moved by a small area dedicated to the youngest victim, a toddler who had barely learned to walk. The family had created a miniature playground beneath his memorial tree, complete with a tiny swing and colorful pinwheels that spun gently in the afternoon breeze. The sight of these toys, placed with such love and care, represented all the childhood experiences this little boy would never have. William paused at the memorial for the child who had reminded him so much of Prince George. The boy's parents had arranged his soccer cleats and team photos around the base of the tree, along with a hand-drawn picture showing the child scoring a goal while his parents cheered from the sidelines. The drawing, clearly created by one of his teammates, captured the pure joy that sports had brought to this young life, and the dreams that had been cut short. The garden visit provided a more intimate setting for William and Catherine to have deeper conversations with individual families. Without the formal structure of the memorial service, these interactions became even more personal and emotionally challenging. They found themselves learning details about each child's personality, their favorite foods, their fears, and their dreams for the future. One mother shared the story of her daughter's collection of stuffed animals, explaining how the little girl had given each one a name and a detailed backstory. The woman had brought one of these toys to the garden, a small elephant named Peanut, and she told Catherine about the elaborate tea parties her daughter used to host for her stuffed animal friends. The ordinary nature of these childhood activities made their loss even more poignant, highlighting the simple joys that had been taken away. Catherine found herself thinking about her own children's stuffed animals and bedtime rituals, realizing how these seemingly small moments actually represented the foundation of childhood happiness. The mother's voice grew soft as she described finding all of her daughter's stuffed animals arranged in a circle in the child's bedroom, as if they were still waiting for their next tea party invitation. William was drawn into a conversation with a grandfather who had been teaching his grandson to fish. The older man had brought the child's small fishing rod to place beside the memorial tree, and he spoke about their weekend trips to a nearby lake. His voice filled with pride as he described his grandson's excitement when he caught his first fish, and the way the boy had insisted on throwing it back because he didn't want to hurt it. These stories of ordinary family activities and childhood milestones created a vivid picture of lives that had been lived fully despite their brevity. William and Catherine began to understand that their role was not just to acknowledge the tragedy of these deaths, but to celebrate and honor the lives that had been lived. Each child had made a unique impact on their families and communities, and these memorial conversations were helping to preserve and share those individual legacies. The most difficult moment in the garden came when they encountered a family who had lost 2 children in the tragedy. The parents, who had somehow found the strength to create memorial spaces for both of their lost children, showed William and Catherine the different items they had chosen to represent each child's personality. One memorial featured art supplies and colorful drawings, while the other showcased books and a small telescope that spoke to the child's love of astronomy. The father explained that his children had been best friends as well as siblings, always planning adventures and taking care of each other. He described how the older child had always looked out for the younger one, and how they had shared a bedroom by choice rather than necessity, because they didn't want to be separated even at bedtime. The bond between these siblings had been extraordinary, and their parents found some comfort in knowing that they were still together. Catherine struggled to find appropriate words of comfort for parents who had lost not 1, but 2 children. The enormity of their grief seemed beyond anything that conventional sympathy could address. Instead, she found herself simply listening and bearing witness to their love for their children, understanding that sometimes presence and attention were more valuable than any word she could offer. As they continued through the garden, William noticed that several family members had begun to follow them, creating an informal group of parents, grandparents, and siblings who seemed reluctant to end their interactions with the royal couple. These families appeared to find comfort in sharing their memories and in seeing the genuine emotion that William and Catherine were displaying in response to their stories. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the memorial garden and creating a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the intensity of emotion that everyone was experiencing. The beauty of the natural setting, combined with the love that was evident in every memorial display, created a space that felt both sacred and comforting. During a quiet moment, Catherine found herself standing alone beside the memorial for the little girl who had resembled Princess Charlotte. She read the handwritten messages that friends and family had left, learning about the child's love of dancing and her dream of becoming a ballerina. The girl's dance shoes had been carefully placed beside the tree, along with a tutu that still held the faint scent of the perfume she had liked to spray on her costumes. William joined Catherine at this memorial, and together they stood in silence, both thinking about their own daughter and the ordinary moments of childhood that they had learned to treasure even more deeply throughout this difficult day. The fragility of life and the preciousness of family had never felt more immediate or more important. As their time in the garden drew to a close, William and Catherine were approached by several families who wanted to express their gratitude for the time and attention they had given to honoring their children's memories. These expressions of thanks, coming from people who were dealing with unimaginable loss, highlighted the meaningful impact that their presence had provided during this difficult day. As the day drew to a close, William and Catherine prepared to take their leave from the memorial garden. The emotional weight of everything they had experienced was evident in their faces, and both had long since abandoned any attempt to hide their tears. The genuine grief they had shown throughout the day had created a connection with the families that transcended the usual boundaries between royalty and subjects. The final moments of their visit were perhaps the most powerful of the entire day. As they prepared to walk back to their car, several family members spontaneously gathered around them. What began as formal goodbyes transformed into something much more personal and meaningful. Parents who had shared their most precious memories found themselves embracing the royal couple as if they were old friends who had shared in their grief. One mother, whose composure had remained steady throughout most of the day, finally broke down as she thanked Catherine for the way she had honored her son's memory. Through her tears, she explained that seeing Catherine's genuine emotion had somehow validated her own grief and made her feel less alone in her pain. The mother's words highlighted the profound impact that authentic royal compassion could have during times of national tragedy. William found himself in a similar situation with a father who had lost his only child. The man who worked as a teacher and had always maintained great respect for the royal family told William that he had never expected to feel such a personal connection during a royal visit. He explained that William's willingness to share his own experiences with loss had provided comfort in a way that no formal condolences could have achieved. As they made their way toward their waiting car, William and Catherine were accompanied by a small group of family members who seemed reluctant to let them go. The informal procession created a powerful image of shared humanity, with the royal couple walking side by side with parents and grandparents whose lives had been forever changed by tragedy. The media representatives who had covered the event found themselves documenting something unprecedented in royal history. Instead of the typical formal photographs of royal visits, they were capturing images of genuine grief, authentic emotion, and real human connection. The pictures would later be described as some of the most moving royal photographs ever taken, not because of their formal composition, but because of the raw humanity they revealed. Catherine's tears were particularly notable because they represented a departure from the traditional royal approach to public grief. Throughout history, members of the royal family had been expected to maintain composure and dignity even in the most emotional situations. Catherine's visible emotion, rather than being seen as a breach of protocol, was widely interpreted as a sign of genuine compassion and humanity that made her more relatable and beloved to the public. William's own struggle with emotion was equally significant, particularly given his role as the future king. The sight of the man who would one day lead the nation showing such vulnerability and genuine care created a powerful impression of the kind of monarch he might become. His willingness to share personal experiences and show authentic emotion suggested a more accessible and compassionate style of leadership. As they reached their car, both William and Catherine turned back one final time to wave to the families who had gathered to see them off. This simple gesture prompted another wave of emotion from the crowd, with several people calling out words of thanks and expressing their appreciation for the time and attention they had received. The car ride back to Kensington Palace was conducted in near silence, with both William and Catherine lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced. The transition from the intense emotional atmosphere of the memorial back to the relative normalcy of their royal routine felt jarring and surreal. Catherine stared out the window at the familiar London streets, but her mind remained focused on the faces of the families they had just left behind. William reached over and took his wife's hand, a gesture that spoke to their shared understanding of how profoundly the day had affected them both. Neither felt the need to discuss what had happened immediately. They both understood that they would need time to process the emotional impact of what they had witnessed and experienced. The weight of representing the nation's grief during such a personal tragedy had challenged them in ways they had never anticipated. As they arrived back at Kensington Palace, both William and Catherine felt the strange disconnection that comes from returning to normal life after experiencing something extraordinary. Their children would be waiting for them, eager to hear about their day and to share their own experiences from school and play. The challenge would be transitioning back into their roles as parents while still carrying the emotional weight of the families they had met. Catherine went immediately to check on their children, finding comfort in the ordinary sounds of childhood that filled their home. Prince George was working on homework at the kitchen table, Princess Charlotte was playing with her dolls in the living room, and Prince Louis was building an elaborate tower with blocks. The normalcy of these scenes provided a stark contrast to the memorial gardens they had just left, but also served as a reminder of how precious these everyday moments truly were. William joined his family for their evening routine, but both he and Catherine found themselves more attentive than usual to the small details of their children's activities. They listened more carefully to Charlotte's stories about her day at school, paid closer attention to George's concerns about an upcoming test, and spent extra time reading bedtime stories to Louis. The events of the day had heightened their awareness of how quickly childhood moments could become precious memories. Later that evening, after their children were asleep, William and Catherine finally had the opportunity to discuss their experiences. They sat together in William's study, the same room where they had prepared for the day that morning, and began to process the emotional journey they had shared. Both acknowledged that the day had affected them more deeply than any previous royal engagement. Catherine spoke about her struggle to maintain composure while listening to the parents' stories, and how the authentic grief she had witnessed had made her question whether showing emotion was appropriate during such occasions. William reassured her that her genuine response had clearly provided comfort to the families, and that her tears had validated their own grief in a way that formal sympathy never could have achieved. William shared his own challenges with the day, particularly his difficulty in finding adequate words to express sympathy for losses that seemed beyond the reach of language. He spoke about the father who had lost 2 children, and how inadequate every traditional expression of condolence had seemed in the face of such enormous grief. The experience had taught him that sometimes presence and attention were more valuable than words. Both William and Catherine recognized that the day had changed their understanding of their royal roles in fundamental ways. They had always known that their duties would sometimes involve difficult situations, but nothing had prepared them for the intensity of shared grief they had experienced. The memorial had shown them that authentic emotion and genuine compassion could be more powerful than any formal protocol. The impact of the day extended beyond their personal experience to influence their future approach to royal duties. They realized that the public's response to their emotional authenticity had demonstrated a hunger for more genuine connections between the royal family and the people they served. The traditional model of distant, formal royalty was being replaced by a more accessible and emotionally available style of service. In the days that followed, William and Catherine received hundreds of letters from members of the public who had been moved by the images and reports from the memorial service. Many writers expressed appreciation for seeing the royal couple show genuine emotion, explaining that it had made them feel more connected to the monarchy and more confident that their leaders truly cared about ordinary people's suffering. Their families they had met also reached out to express their continued gratitude for the time and attention they had received. Several parents wrote to say that the royal couple's visible emotion had helped them feel less alone in their grief, and that knowing their children's lives had moved the future, King and Queen provided ongoing comfort during their darkest days. The memorial service marked a turning point in William and Catherine's royal careers, establishing them as a couple willing to show vulnerability and authentic emotion in their public service. The images of Catherine's tears and William's obvious struggle with composure became iconic representations of a more human and accessible style of monarchy that would define their future approach to royal duties. As they reflected on the experience, in the weeks that followed, both William and Catherine understood that they had participated in something that transcended typical royal protocol. They had shared in genuine human grief, offered authentic comfort to families in their darkest hour, and demonstrated that the monarchy could be both dignified and deeply human. The day had tested their emotional strength, but had ultimately strengthened their commitment to serving their future subjects with genuine compassion and authentic care.